I'm Heather. After many wasted years trying outdated approaches to my daughter's addiction that felt wrong to me, harmed our relationship, and didn't help my daughter, I finally found an effective, evidence-based approach that repaired my relationship with her, helped me create my own peace of mind, and made me an ally in my daughter's recovery. I teach you a loving and compassionate approach to help you encourage change and create connection. Addiction impacts the entire family system. Family recovery is the answer. Today, you're going to hear a conversation between Nicole Miller and I about addiction pharmacology. As Nicole explained it, addiction pharmacology is about drugs, the brain, and what drugs do to the brain. I wanted to have this conversation to help you understand addiction better, because the better we understand addiction, the easier it is for us to collaborate with and support our kids. It also helps us take it less personally, which makes it way less painful, and to have more compassion. Nicole is a certified alcohol and drug counselor in the state of Oregon. She's also a certified professional coach. Nicole holds a bachelor's degree in human development and has worked in the addiction field since 2010. She provides coaching and case management to individual families impacted by addiction. Nicole also teaches addiction pharmacology for college students and other individuals seeking to earn certification as an addiction counselor. She has a significant knowledge and expertise of the ways in which addiction alters the way the brain functions and the difficulties individuals face in recovery as a result of this. Nicole is passionate about helping her clients achieve long-term recovery, as well as providing high-quality training to those seeking to become helping professionals in the addiction field. I will put Nicole's contact information in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy the podcast episode today. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Living with Addiction podcast. I'm here with Nicole Miller, and we are going to talk about addiction pharmacology. So, Nicole, thank you for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate you making the time for it. I know how busy your schedule is.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, first, do you want to explain what addiction pharmacology is?
Yeah, totally. So, kind of the short answer, and what I tell my students when I teach this class, is essentially we're talking about drugs, the brain, and what drugs do to the brain. And in the realm of like addiction, and when drugs enter the brain, the changes that happen. We talk about things related to tolerance and withdrawal, and just all of these changes that happen in the brain. So,
okay, that's a great explanation, easy to understand, and really important. Because I think that even though I was dealing with my daughter's addiction, that was probably several years in before I really started actually researching addiction, which seems like anything else, any other thing, like somebody had cancer or heart disease or something like that, we would be getting more education on it. So it only makes sense to get more education when your child is dealing with addiction as well. So what does addiction do to a person's brain?
Oh my gosh, so much. So, and yeah, it's like hard to even know where to start, but essentially it changes the wiring. It changes the way your brain operates, and it does it in a really important way. So I think, a lot of people have heard that, right? Addiction changes the wiring of your brain, but like, what does that mean? So the primary parts of the brain that all drugs of abuse impact are the parts that are associated with reward. So the same part of your brain that when you satisfy a survival need, so when you eat food, when we have sex, things like that, it sends out reward chemicals, neurotransmitters. And that tells us this is important for survival. Keep doing that. Mm-hmm. So drugs activate that same part of the brain, and they do it on a much, much larger scale. So for somebody who is struggling with addiction, the drug, as far as their brain concerned, equals survival at that point. And then what happens when people go to get in recovery and start to get sober is that their brain has become accustomed to dopamine as the primary neurotransmitter. Their brain has been accustomed to levels that are way, way higher than what normally rewarding things would give them. So one example I use is like hanging out with your kids, right? Maybe before you were using, you really enjoyed that connection and it was really gratifying and rewarding. You go through a period of addiction, whatever that looks like, and then you come on the other side of it, and here you're trying to be sober and you're doing things like hanging out with your kids and things that are supposed to feel enjoyable. And it's not registering. And so that's, really one of the big things and one of the big challenges that people face in early recovery is that nothing feels good.
Okay, you made so many great points. I want to look at a couple of them individually. One of them was you were saying that the rewiring or the wiring changes that happen in the brain and the reward system tell the person who's abusing the substances that this is important for survival. Mm-hmm. So it feels that important to them to use.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's because, the part of the brain that we're talking about is like the oldest part of our brain. So that it evolved before our ability to think and reason and plan and problem solve and all of that stuff. This is that basic primitive part of the brain that says, these things feel good, do more of that. These things over here are bad, scary, and could kill us, do less of that. And so anything that activates that reward center to that high of a level, the brain's like, oh, I must need this to survive. It's the same thing when you eat food. It's the same thing, the same process.
And that part of the brain is so focused on survival. It doesn't really care about fulfillment, right? It's just mainly whatever it takes to keep you alive.
Yeah. And what do you mean when you say fulfillment?
Well, I mean, like, one of the other things you were saying is like everyday things aren't as satisfying. Mm-hmm. So we wonder like why a mother wouldn't enjoy spending time with her kids or wouldn't even be able to quit to spend time with her children, or why our kids don't care about the things that they used to love anymore. And it's because their brain is wired to, I have to have this drug to survive versus seeking fulfillment in other ways.
Yeah. And one point I want to make is the earlier that somebody starts using, the worse this is. So there's a big difference between someone who starts using in adolescence compared to someone who starts using in adulthood. In adolescence, you don't have anything to compare it to. So in terms of like rewarding experiences for adults have gone through enough of life that they've had connected relationships or they've had activities and things they go out and do that, bring enjoyment and bring reward. Adolescents have not had that. So their brain learns right away that it's like to be rewarding, it has to reach this high level.
So then that makes it even harder for an adolescent to quit then when they're trying to get sober.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, significantly harder because all the things that, as an adolescent, what do? You want to hang out with your friends, pretty much hang out with your friends, right?
Right.
Social connections, like all of the quote unquote normal things that an adolescent would enjoy literally are not hitting you think about what's that thing at the carnival where you hit it and it goes up.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's like hitting that over and over and over again and never hitting the bell. That's what it's like for adolescents. And the numbers, like the research shows that people who start using in adolescence compared to someone who can delay use until even 18 or 20, the rates of addiction are significantly higher for those who start in adolescence.
And does that mean that it takes longer for them to recover, or just that it's harder, or it takes their brain longer to heal?
It could. It means that they are going to have a significantly higher chance of developing into full-blown addiction than if somebody uses meth at age 25 compared to age 13. Their chances of developing full-blown meth addiction are significantly lower. It doesn't mean it can't happen, right? But significantly lower than the adolescent who starts using.
So that's a great point, because that goes to people always want to bring choice into it, right? And which I don't even think is maybe the first time it's a choice, right? But then every single person is different. Everybody's brain is different. Some people, maybe that choice lasts a lot longer, and other people are much more predisposed to getting addicted sooner. And it sounds like adolescence is one of those factors that makes somebody predisposed to getting addicted sooner.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So now, what is happening in the brain when they're trying to be in recovery? So they're trying to be completely abstinent from the substance that their brain thought was really important for their survival.
Such a great question. So, there's quite a few stages that people have to go through, especially in early recovery. So there's the acute withdrawal, which is different depending on whatever substance somebody is using. So that first, from the time they stop using till could be a couple weeks, for some substance could be up to a month, that acute phase where they're in physical, psychological withdrawal. If it's something like opiates, they're very, very sick. If it's something like amphetamines or other stimulants, they're very, very tired. So, but once they get through that phase, then it's like everything else. So for one, their brain is having to figure out how to navigate the world with like normal rewards. And so one thing a lot of people experience is, so it's called anhedonia. So anhedonia is the inability to feel pleasure from normally pleasurable things. And so anhedonia is like I used to really enjoy XYZ and I just don't. I used to enjoy hanging out with my kids and it just does, I don't feel anything. I'm not excited about that. And that, that is literally their brain expecting so much dopamine that it was getting from drugs, and it's not getting that because normal rewards don't register that high. They don't create that much dopamine. So with that can look a lot like depression, right? It doesn't mean it's like true clinical depression, but it can look a lot like somebody who's depressed. There is this whole spectrum. So post-acute withdrawal is like basically the whole 2 years, up to 2 years after someone stops using. And the big symptoms of that are, I can't think straight. I have trouble sleeping. Either I'm sleeping too much or I can't sleep at all. My emotions are all over the place. So I'm having either numbness or extreme emotional reactions. Nothing feels good. And I don't want to do anything.
So, and then also, I may or may not be wrong about this. Is their brain also producing less dopamine than, say, yours or mine would at that time as well?
Yes. Yeah. So we talk about dopamine, and dopamine is like the big kind of primary neurotransmitter, but depending on the substance, there's serotonin, there's epinephrine, there's endorphins, and all substances kind of have their specific brain chemicals that they interact with. And yeah, what happens is in some cases, the brain is producing less of those because the brain has learned, oh, hey, this external thing is going to come in and do this for me. So to keep it safe, because the brain wants to be, it's called homeostasis, like a state of balance, it's going to adjust. So it will start producing less of those neurotransmitters. The other thing that happens is, so on all of our brain cells, we have what's called receptor sites. And so you think of the receptor site of a brain cell like the lock, and the neurotransmitter is the key that activates it. So one thing that will happen in the brain is that the cells will downregulate. So they will have less less receptor sites. So what that means is the brain then needs more of whatever it is. And this is part of how tolerance develops. So if we're talking about heroin, the brain then needs more heroin to get the same effect.
Okay. And so then a person in recovery whose brain is making less, and I'm just going to say dopamine, even though there's lots of other neurotransmitters, their brain is making less dopamine and they have less receptors to absorb the smaller amount of dopamine that they're making as well.
Yeah.
And so how long typically does that last for a person?
So, that's a bit kind of one of those big, it can vary type of things. But, when we're talking about that post-acute withdrawal and kind of the brain trying to reset itself, it can be years. I mean, 2 years is kind of the standard when we talk about like post-acute withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
But for some people, it can be longer. Like, I think it depends a lot on the person and their individual just biological factors. It depends on what and how much they were using and for how long. All of that stuff can impact it.
So when somebody's trying to get sober, then they're having to navigate restarting their life, right? Or I say restarting, like most of the time it's completely starting over. And they have to do that without the, what I'll call feel good chemicals that you and I have and depend on to get through the day every day. Mm-hmm. They've got to start their whole life over like that.
Yeah. And I mean, that, like, in a nutshell, is so much of what makes early recovery challenging and what can make it so hard for people to stay in recovery, because it's kind of like this, wait, I got sober to like feel like this all the time.
Feel like shit all the time, basically.
Yeah, just to walk around feeling, I wasn't sure if we could say bad words here. So yeah, like I didn't, like, why did I get sober? Just to feel like shit. And the thing is it can come and go, so it's not that it's like 2 years of perpetual just feeling like garbage all the time. There will be periods of kind of feeling more normal. Mm-hmm. And then it can come back and you can be going through that again. And that can be really challenging, particularly because when people are coming out of addiction, a lot of times we're not like well equipped with like lots of coping skills and lots of distress tolerance and all of that stuff. Yeah. And then without like this understanding too, I think one thing that comes up for a lot of people is this feeling of, what am I doing wrong, or what's wrong with me? Right. Because somewhere in there, you get this expectation. Well, if I get clean, my life is supposed to get better and I'll just feel better.
Yeah. Why don't I feel normal now? I stopped.
Yeah. I stopped.
It's got to be very discouraging.
What do you want?
Yeah. Okay. And so you mentioned post-acute withdrawal. Is that the S, symptoms or syndrome?
Syndrome.
Okay. Post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or PAWS. And it lasts up to 2 years. So that can come and go, this set of symptoms that you mentioned earlier. And I can only imagine experiencing that, like wondering what it is every time, not really knowing, second guessing. Is that really what it is? Or should I be doing something else? I can only imagine that that's a huge part of the struggle with those 2 years of really trying to get back in balance.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the acute withdrawal phase. I just wanted to touch on that for a minute, because I've watched my daughter. She was on heroin and meth. And so she was physically addicted to heroin. And I've watched her go through withdrawals several times. And it was really horrible. It is, I can't even imagine somebody or facing that myself, like knowing the pain that I was going to go through to stop doing something. And so if you've never seen it before, can you describe some of what withdrawal symptoms are like?
Yeah. So it's going to vary for all the substances, but if we're talking about like things like heroin and opiates, because some classes of substances have really intense physical withdrawal symptoms, others like meth, if somebody's just using meth, like it's uncomfortable and you don't feel good, but it's nothing compared to like an opiate withdrawal. So for things like opiates, when you think about like the worst flu you've ever had, complete with the stomach stuff. So you're puking, you're having diarrhea, you're sweating, you're shaking, the whole 9 yards. And you're doing that for a week, maybe more. For a lot of people, it can be longer than that. Feeling, like your skin is like literally just like that you're crawling out of your skin. Anxiety is a huge part of that. Yeah, it's just awful.
Yeah. And the anxiety's got to come from your brain saying, hey, we need that stuff to survive, and you're not using it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like withdrawal is your brain and your body's attempt to get back into homeostasis. So when we think of addiction, so when somebody's addicted, they are in essence normal with the drug, and withdrawal is not normal without at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, there was one time Helena was going through withdrawals and she was trying to get to the point that she could take Suboxone, and she was doing it at home, and she took the Suboxone too soon and went into precipitated withdrawals and ended up really in crisis. She was having, it was kind of like seizures, but not really seizures. And we ended up having to send her to the emergency room. And it was just a really, really horrible experience. And it gives me so much compassion for anybody that is facing going through that, because even if they go to a detox and they are getting medically assisted through the detox process, they have to be far enough into withdrawals and quite uncomfortable for long enough before they can take something that's really going to help relieve that. So I think that's something like Helena, for a long time, when she would go to detox, she would end up leaving before she got to the place that she could take something, because the discomfort was so overwhelming of going through that detox phase. So I just like to point that out for anybody that's listening that has not seen somebody go through that. It is something really to have compassion for what that person goes through to get off of those drugs.
Yeah, so much. So much.
So what else makes people susceptible to relapse and early recovery? Is it just the lack of neurotransmitters and receptors, or are there other factors that contribute to that?
There's definitely, I mean, it's so much to that. I mean, yes, it's the way their brain works. And if they're in withdrawal, if they're even in like psychological withdrawal, I mean, if we're talking about like stimulants, people, they feel depressed and fatigued and like they can't get up and do things and all of that. But then there's even just the social factors, right? Like hanging around with people or wanting to kind of go back and make those connections. I think whether or not someone has support is going to be a huge factor in whether or not they end up relapsing. So I think it's just kind of this, what's the word I'm looking for? Like all of these things that kind of come together to like set the stage for that.
Yeah. And we were talking about meth. I think people can end up being fatigued for weeks or months, right? Like just wanting to sleep all the time.
Yeah.
And it's not laziness. It is their body genuinely needing that to repair.
So with things like meth, so our body produces its own natural energy chemicals. So the two big ones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so you think about anytime you're in a situation maybe where you need an extra burst of energy, right? So if you are being chased by a saber-toothed tiger and you have to run away really fast,
right?
Those are the chemicals that your brain is going to release more of to help like get you out of there. When you use a stimulant, it releases way more of those chemicals without there being an actual need for it. So that's why people on meth get all twitchy and 90 miles a minute and all the, all the stuff that goes with that. But what it does is it depletes our own natural energy chemicals. So you take that away and your brain's like, well, I haven't been needed here. So I'm not producing these to that level anymore. And so, yeah, you're just like dead tired.
Yeah.
I don't even know if tired is not even like an adequate word for what that is.
Depleted, I would say.
Yeah, depleted. Yeah.
And another thing to really have compassion for when somebody's going through that, their body, their brain, everything needs time to heal. And then, like you mentioned, the factor of community. So all of their friends before were using or abusing substances. And so now a lot of times, maybe even if they don't have the support system of their family, like they've got to rebuild their whole community again. And it's a lot to face on top of not feeling well and not having their neurotransmitters or the energy or anything like that you need. When you think about those things combined, I really just have so much respect. And I think it's amazing how hard somebody has to work to get and stay sober.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the stigma around addiction has this idea that like, well, you should just be able to decide that you're done, maybe get some help, that's cool. We're on board with that these days. Then just like get back to it. I'll go do all the things that, especially as an adult, right? Get a job, pay your bills, keep track of things, do all these things. But we have people whose brains are not working right? Like they don't, they can't think clearly. They can't problem solve all of these things. They feel like crap. And they're like, well, what do I do for fun? Who do I hang out with? And it doesn't even matter because I wouldn't like it if I did.
Right.
Right? So what do I do?
Right. Yeah. And that's why family support and connection is so important, and why I'm just going to say this over and over again, probably in every podcast until you guys get sick of hearing me say it, that why I think it's important to help make it easy, remove any barriers to getting help that you can for your loved one. Call around and then let them make the final call to get in somewhere, but help them out, support them in the process, help them find a sober living to stay in, like make it as easy as possible as you can for them. That is not enabling. Like we hear that they should be the one. I mean, I've called rehabs before and had them tell me, oh, well, your daughter should be the one calling. So you call and then you even get the messaging that what you're doing is wrong. And I just want to reinforce it is not wrong. They say, if your daughter really wants to be here, then she'll be the one calling. Well, thank you, but I'm going to make all the calls and find a good place and then she can call you. Like, I'm just going to make this as easy as possible for her because she has enough to go through. Yeah. And people can be working really hard at it and still struggling.
Yeah, 100%. And I think about, so I'm in recovery and I think about when I was in my addiction, I wouldn't have had the first clue how to navigate the system of getting into treatment or doing any of that. So I might have been like, oh, I want to stop. And then that's as far as that would have gone. And I'm thankful that I had family that were willing to be there to help, because I would have had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Navigating the system has been overwhelming for me. Right? Like I'm sober and I have the time and the energy and the brain power to make all of these calls and navigating insurance and all the other things. Like it is overwhelming to try to figure all that, like find the place that takes your insurance, find how much it's going to cost, when they can get in there, all of these hoops that you've got to jump through. I think that it's hard for anybody. So let's just remove that and make it as easy as possible for them to just here's a couple places, decide where you want to go.
Right.
So I want to talk about medication assisted treatment for a few minutes, because I think that I always cringe. I'm in a couple of groups that are where, people are talking about addiction and somebody will ask like, my kid wants to get on Suboxone or something else, some other medication assisted treatment. And everybody starts talking about how bad it is because it can be abused. And I think that I consider it a life-saving medication, but so many people have vilified it just because it can be abused, or they know somebody that abused it. So nobody should ever use it. So can you explain what it is?
Yes. So medication-assisted treatment is, in essence, a treatment modality. So this is for, not just opiates. They do it for alcohol and other stuff, but we're going to talk about it in the context of opiates because that's kind of the big one. So it's using a medication. So typically some sort of opiate. So the kind of the big ones are Suboxone. Methadone is the one that's been around forever. It's like the single most researched treatment modality ever. And because it's so controversial, there had to be like shit tons of research on it. So using a medication to give to someone who is opiate dependent with the purpose of navigating cravings, or lessening cravings, and also keeping that person out of withdrawal so that they can engage in a treatment program, go to counseling, group counseling, individual counseling, so that they can engage in the rest of their life, do all the things that are expected, right? Go out and get a job and repair their relationships and have fun, whatever. All these things that people do in life, them being able to do that because they're not in withdrawal and they're not having cravings.
Well, yeah. And cravings was something that we hadn't even talked about yet that continues within abstinence. I know that was something my daughter was still struggling with after months of being abstinent.
Yeah. I mean, cravings can last for years. And when a craving hits, when you're sitting here and you're not in the midst of one, rational, you know that cravings are short lived, right? They kind of come and go. But when you're in the midst of one, it feels like it's going to last forever. And that is it's your brain saying, hey, I need this thing. I need it to feel normal. I need it to get back to homeostasis. So, and it's coming from this subconscious part of your brain, right? So nobody is like walking around going, oh gosh, I want to have a heroin craving right now. They're walking along, minding their own business, doing whatever it is they're doing. And then suddenly they're in the midst of a craving because they smelled something, saw something, heard something. Something happened at the subconscious level that triggered that. And that's another thing that one can catch people off guard. Like if they're not if they don't have an expectation that that is a normal part of recovery, because it is, and it doesn't mean anything. A lot of times people attach this meaning of I'm doing something wrong because I'm having cravings. And it is this very temporary thing, but people have to be able to kind of have an understanding of that and then have the skills to manage through it. Because when you're in that, it's really easy to get to that impulsive place of I'm having a craving, I have to fix this. I'm going to go use.
Yeah.
So kind of going back to medication assisted treatment, that is, so the medications, so, whether it's methadone or Suboxone or naltrexone, what they do is they go in and they occupy the receptors in the brain. So they occupy it without activating it. And each of those substances that I mentioned do it in a different way. And I can explain that if you want. But so they're occupying it. So the receptors are satisfied. They're like, okay, I got what I need, but it's not getting them high. I think one of the misconceptions and one of the judgments around medication assisted treatment is that, oh, people are just taking these medications and they're just getting high all the time for free, basically, and just having a blast. And it's not like that. So for methadone, methadone goes in, and now methadone is a full activator. So the word would be agonist. So it's a full activator. So if someone were to take too much methadone, they would feel high and they could overdose. Okay. So if somebody is on a therapeutic dose, and therapeutic dose is determined by the doctor who's prescribing it and the medical professionals in the clinic, if they're on that therapeutic dose, you wouldn't be able to tell a difference between them or you and I.
Yeah.
So, but it is a full activator. So there is some risk with that, in that if people are not taking it correctly, not taking it as prescribed, or using other things on top of it, it does have dangers as far as overdose goes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's methadone. Suboxone is a little bit different, because Suboxone goes in and it's if you think about that lock and you think about having a key, methadone is the key fits perfectly in the lock. Suboxone is the key goes in the lock, but doesn't really turn, right? So it's not quite a perfect fit. So what that means is it still activates the receptors. So the receptors are still satisfied. The person's still not in withdrawal, but it's not getting them high. Now, for some people might report and especially people who don't have a tolerance will say that taken Suboxone and felt something from that. And that can happen. But in essence, it's nothing like going out and taking a bunch of heroin or any other full-on opiate. It's also safer because it has a ceiling effect. So the ceiling effect means that you can only take so much. And once you hit a certain point, there isn't going to be any other effect.
Mm-hmm.
So that is protective in terms of things like overdose.
Okay. So I've heard a lot of people say oh, it's just switching one addiction for another.
Yeah, yes, people say that all the time. And it's not. I mean, that's just such a harmful misconception we have to move away from. Because are they using a substance to manage their symptoms of withdrawal and craving? Yes. But that's very different than I'm out abusing street drugs and and doing all these things. If somebody is working their recovery program and engaging in medication assisted treatment and all of that, that's what we want. And the reality is, particularly for people who use opiates, in abstinence-based treatment models, so non-medication assisted treatment, the dropout rates are astronomical. Most people drop out at the 3-day mark and they don't come back, right? Or they keep trying over and over again. Yeah. And I mean, they're just not successful. Yeah. For people in medication assisted treatment who are on a high enough dose, because that's the other thing is people think that they're like doctors and think like, oh, your dose is too high. And well, I don't know about you. I don't have a medical license. That's not my place to say. And so they're on a dose that is good for them. Like you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And if they're out having a job or doing whatever, living their life, who's to say that's wrong?
Let's be really clear about the getting high part on the methadone. I just want to hit that again. So the getting high, it's very low level, right? When you say getting high, I think you said when you take methadone, there is some high to it.
So methadone is a full opiate agonist.
Okay.
So it's a full opiate. So if somebody who's never taken opiates and doesn't have a tolerance to them takes methadone, like they're going to feel the euphoric effects.
Okay.
But that's one of the things that somebody in a medication assisted treatment program, they're going to be working with a medical prescriber. They take into account things like tolerance and history of use and all of those things. And so when that person is on their therapeutic dose, it's not getting them high. Like they're not walking around.
Right. Okay, I'm glad that we clarified that.
Yeah. But that is one of the things is because people can, and because in these treatment modalities, just like any treatment modality, I think it's interesting how people get all fired up about medication assisted treatment and like, oh, they like divert their meds or they like take it not as prescribed. And it's like, I mean, does that not happen in like other treatment modalities? Like people are using, right. So, yeah.
And methadone is very highly regulated. Like when Helena was on it, what's really one in the beginning and until you build, I guess, after you've been on it for a while, you have to go every single day to get your dose.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And one thing that really stood out to me when I went to the methadone clinic with Helena was she's sitting there in the chair. She's like passed out, right? Because she's been up all night. She's living this drug lifestyle. And everybody else that came in there was like bright and happy. They were on their way to work. And I could just see in them like, wow, these people are really living a life and are happy about it. It wasn't just this, I could just really see the difference. Like in that moment, I could feel the truth of how much that was helping these people to change their lives. And it was nothing like somebody who was living in active addiction.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's the thing is that, and for that population, like to get to that point, like it's just not like the research does not support that abstinence-based treatment is what gets them there. And so for me, it's like, if you need a medication to be able to live your life in that way and out of active addiction, then who's to say that's wrong?
So when
it's
somebody,
a lifesaver.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel strongly that if my daughter had stayed on Suboxone, that she would probably still be alive today. I wish that she had stayed on it longer. And that's one of the reasons I'm such a strong advocate for it and want people to be properly educated about it, because people who aren't, and even in 12-step programs, you can't get a sponsor if you're on medication assisted treatment a lot of times because those programs don't believe in it. They don't understand it. They haven't changed with the times. But isn't somebody's brain also like isn't that giving their brain time to heal as well? Like do their neurotransmitters start producing regularly and then they're able to absorb them as well? Is that healing taking place while somebody's on MAT?
Yeah, because again, it kind of goes back to that experience of like reward and that intense reward when they're being managed, like they're not getting those like huge hits of dopamine. And it's not the same as going out and doing a big old hit of heroin. It's just not the same. And some of the other things that are necessary for the brain to heal and for all of that healing to take place is that like participation in life, right? Like building meaningful connections and relationships and taking care of yourself physically, mentally, spiritually, all the things that people are able to do when they're not having to worry about being in withdrawal and all the stuff that comes with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is just so important too. The process of rebuilding your life is overwhelming enough. You think about just the small process somebody goes through when they go through a divorce or a big move or something like that. It is just so stressful, or a job change, right? And this person, when somebody's recovering, like they're having to start over in every single area of their life, not just one. And so when you think about how stressed out you are about a new job or divorce or move or whatever it is, imagine going through all of those things and then some all at once. And I think that gives a little bit more insight into what somebody's going through. The last thing I wanted to ask about was fentanyl. And because like I've heard that it's more addictive and you have to use it more often than other drugs. And that's one of the reasons that fentanyl is getting mixed in with a lot of other drugs, so that takes somebody who maybe was a casual user or not using as much, and now suddenly that person's got to buy all the time because they're addicted to fentanyl.
Yeah, so it is a short-acting opiate. So when we talk about short-acting versus long-acting, short-acting means like you use it and it peaks and the effects wear off very quickly. So when it's the same thing as like cocaine, right? Like anything about like cocaine use, people use cocaine and they binge on it because it wears off in like 30 seconds or whatever. So fentanyl is the same, is it wears off really quickly. So people are having to keep going back and keep using more. And the other, one of the other big things when we're talking about fentanyl is you think about it and you think, oh, like they give that stuff in the hospitals. But what's on the streets is not medical fentanyl. It's this synthetic shit that's made with all these like cheap ingredients so it's easy to make a lot of it. And it's really dangerous, right? Because you don't know like what is actually in it. And it's these like street chemists that are making it.
Yeah. So that is why when they're trying to cut their drugs with fentanyl, why people are getting killed, because it's not properly measured or managed, or who knows how much actually ends up in there or what happened during the process of making it. Or I know that like when my daughter used, wasn't the first time she had used from whatever she bought. But so like the whole batch that she had, batch makes it sound so big, but whatever amount she had that she bought, like it wasn't all lethal, right? Just part of it was. And that's what's so scary about it, is that you just never really know with it. And it is short, like even the medical grade fentanyl is short acting. Like I remember after one of my surgeries last year, they gave it to me just to get my pain down enough for me to get home. And it was wearing off before I got home, which was like, with like 30 minutes later, the pain was coming back. And I was like, this is not, it wears off so fast. So I can so did they go into withdrawals that quickly as well?
They can, yeah. Yeah. Like if they don't have anything else they're using and those effects start wearing off. Yeah.
So they go, they're feeling sick sooner than if they had used heroin.
Yeah.
And then I guess since heroin's not as strong, it just doesn't cut it anymore when somebody's addicted to fentanyl.
Yeah. Yeah. And so fentanyl is way more potent. And I can't remember the exact number, but then you compare it to things like heroin or like Oxycontin or some of the other like pain pills that are out there. It's significantly more potent than any of those. So, and I think the other scary thing with fentanyl is that you'll have people that are using like stimulants, like using other things. So they don't even know that they're getting fentanyl.
Right. They weren't even planning to buy an opioid or.
Right. Which means they don't have a tolerance. So that's why people are dying so quickly. It's just so scary.
Yeah, it really is. All the more reason to have fentanyl test strips and Narcan.
Yes.
And often if somebody has used fentanyl, sometimes 2 doses of Narcan are needed. So I've put links to those. I think I'll put them in the show notes again. I've put links to those before, but it's good to know where to get them because we should all have it on hand. Is there anything, I think we covered everything that I wanted to go over. Is there anything important that we missed that you want to go back to or you felt like you needed to explain a little bit more?
No, I think that I was thinking about medication assisted treatment. And I think the big thing that I teach this like with my students, and it's interesting because I teach people who are looking to become drug and alcohol counselors. In Oregon, this is like one of the required classes that they have to have. So, and I get just this huge spectrum of like opinions and thoughts. And a lot of times it's influenced by people's own recovery. So the thought is like, oh, well, I got clean this way. So like it should work for everybody. Right. Yeah. And people get all judgy about all this shit, which is crazy to me. Right. Just crazy. Right. But the one thing I really try to instill in my students is that there is no right or wrong answer in terms of how long somebody's in MAT. And really the research shows that longer treatment episodes are associated with better outcomes. So like there is no right or wrong answer. And if people want or need to be on it long term, like that's okay and they should be.
Yeah.
Right. Like somebody being on Suboxone for 2 years is vastly better than somebody ODing on fentanyl in the streets.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Then with dosage too, people go around thinking they're doctors.
Right.
It's like you don't tell someone their dose is too high or too low unless you have a medical license. And I just think that those things are so important because people can be influenced and you have your friends and all their opinions. And if they're telling somebody, oh, you shouldn't be on that or your dose is too this or that, I just think that can be really dangerous.
Or the bad story about somebody who abused it. So when somebody says something like that, like, well, I got sober a different way and my way is the best way or the only way. Like, can you imagine if like I had breast cancer last year? Can you imagine anybody telling me the way I got rid of cancer was the wrong way because they know somebody else who got rid of it a different way?
We just wouldn't.
Ludicrous.
Yeah, we just wouldn't. And the fact that this is like just somewhere where we're so far behind as far as addiction goes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just, we should be saying like, whatever you need to get help and to be okay.
Yeah.
Like do that.
Because
whatever that is.
On it.
Yeah.
Whatever life-saving tools you need, like we're here to support you, whatever it takes. But I also feel like in some ways people in sobriety are told that as well. And it's like just perpetuating, like they are taught to perpetuate the stigma as they're getting treatment. And like I've wondered that with my daughter, some things that we talked about. Now I look back on it and I think, did she really believe that? Or was she taught that as she was getting sober? And so she believed it because that's what she was told during the process. As I go back and I question a lot of things. And I think that there's just nothing wrong with questioning. And really looking at things like, if this was an addiction, if it was heart disease, or if it was somebody was diabetic or had cancer or whatever, how would we approach it? Like to help remove that stigma of that we shouldn't help people or there's only one way, or if they wanted help, they would figure it out, or we wouldn't tell somebody who had heart disease if they ate a cheeseburger, oh, well, you must not want to be healthy.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's worse, if they wanted help, they would figure it out. And then they do figure something out. And then we tell them that's wrong.
Exactly. Right. If you want to get to the hospital while you're having that heart attack, you'll figure it out. Right. I'm not calling 911 for you. You ate a cheeseburger yesterday. I mean, it's just like, there's just no way.
You did this to yourself.
Right. So much more compassion is needed. But I think that this conversation will make it easier for anybody to understand and have more compassion. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on today. And I will put how to get a hold of you in the show notes. So if anybody wants to find out more. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it 2 different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.